Good morning, everyone. My name is Dean Maines, and I lead an organization here at the Opus College of Business known as the Veritas Institute. And I'm part of the Opus College of Business and then also the broader University of St. Thomas community. I would like to welcome you to this event, the 2019 Winning with Integrity Symposium. The Winning with Integrity series was inaugurated in January of 2016, and it highlights shared challenges that confront leaders in sports organizations and leaders in business. And today's session is the fourth event in this series. The series is organized by the Veritas Institute with support from the Center for Ethics in Practice, as well as our university's athletic department. Now, we've got three main agenda items this morning. We're going to begin with some brief comments from Professor Dawn Elm. Following Dawn's remarks, we're going to move into a panel discussion. And we are very fortunate this morning to have as our moderator, Leah Olson. And then after the panel discussion, you will have an opportunity to add your voice to the conversation in a short question and answer period. And then finally at 10 o'clock, my colleague Michelle Rovang will bring our session to a close. Now, a couple of things I want to mention before we get started. First of all, this event is made possible through the generosity of our sponsors, and I want to acknowledge them. Our silver sponsor today is the Verite Group. The Verite Group provides interim financial and accounting leaders to businesses in the Twin Cities. Our friends at the Minnesota Vikings are serving as a scholar sponsor today. They're underwriting the participation of UST students in this event. Twin Cities Orthopedics is generously serving as a bronze sponsor today. I think there are a couple of people in the crowd from TCO, and I want to point out that my family is a charter member of your frequent flyer program. The Twin Cities chapter of FEI, Financial Executives International, has provided promotional support for this event, as has Minnesota Youth Athletic Services. And while we have one new sponsor today, I want to point out that the majority of our benefactors have been supporting the Winning with Integrity series since its inception, and we are very grateful for their continuing support. Another thing, as Michelle mentioned, today's session is being recorded. And so when we get to the question and answer period, we would ask that you wait until we get a microphone to you before making your comment or asking your question, just so we can record your remark. And then as soon as the video is prepared, it will be posted on the Veritas Institute website. Okay, and we'll remind you of that once we come to that portion of our show. So let's go ahead and begin our discussion. The Opus College of Business is committed to building bridges between the world of scholarship and the world of business practice. And in keeping with that commitment, over the past year, Professors Dawn Elm and Christopher Michelson, together with Michelle Rovang, have engaged members of our athletic department to examine critically and carefully the challenges they face. And these include challenges related to compliance, following the rules as it were, as well as ethical conduct, doing the right thing. And so to start us this morning, I've asked Dawn Elm to just briefly share some of the highlights from this research, which will touch upon the theme of our discussion today, namely, is following the rules enough? Dawn will be setting the table for our panel and for the remainder of our discussion today. So it's my privilege to introduce to you Dawn Elm. Dawn is a longtime member of the Business and Ethics faculty here at the University of St. Thomas. She's one of the holders of the David and Barbara Coach Chair in Business Ethics, as well as the executive director for the Center for Ethics in Practice. So Don.
Thank you, Dean. Good morning, everyone. I had to put on my professorial glasses. Dean asked if I would just spend a couple of minutes telling you a little bit about some of the research that I have been involved with my colleagues. And the research that we have been involved in that is about the linkage between business and athletics came from the experience of pretty much all three of us, myself, Christopher, and Michelle, either being student athletes, being parents of student athletes, being involved in a wide variety of ways in athletic organizations. And we were asked by Steve Fritz, who was the athletic director here at the University of St. Thomas at the time, to come and have a conversation with his coaching staff and talk about some of the major challenges that they were facing, and if we could offer any of our expertise in terms of our research and our academic experience with the ethical challenges that they seem to be facing. And there are many of them, as you're all aware. So there are significant parallels between the challenges of navigating compliance in terms of following the rules and in ethical conduct or making ethical decisions, okay? Which is the topic of what we're doing today. So it's a difficult problem. It affects not only business, it affects not only athletics, it affects all dimensions of our lives. This is, the broadest question is where the law and ethics can converge, where what is legal or what is the right thing to do go together, and the law and ethics can diverge, okay? Where following the law is not necessarily the most ethical choice, or vice versa. So we went and spent some time interviewing coaches and also doing a lot of work on reviewing literature in sports and ethics in athletics. And the conversations we had came up with some interesting revelations that I wanted to share with you today. The first is that the ability for an athletic organization in terms of collegiate athletics is somewhat focused on the organization itself. In other words, the organization has the ability to build a culture, choose certain people, focus on what they consider to be important in terms of how they accomplish their athletic objectives. And that can be significantly different depending on what the institution is. So one of the things we learned is that while there are certain practices and things that could happen here at St. Thomas, they might not be echoed elsewhere. And the other thing that we found is that this kind of tension between compliance and ethics is very much an infrastructure problem. We have large infrastructures, the NCAA, any other compliance organizations in athletics that suggest here are certain rules you should follow in order to compete in an ethical way and fairly. But sometimes rules can have unintended consequences. Sometimes they can also be interpreted in incorrect ways. So we found that we need to have probably infrastructure change, but that's not going to be capable of being done by the people who are doing this on a day-to-day basis, except for making the changes in their organization and making the questions available to the broader community. And that's what's happening with activities like this today. We're getting together and we're having these conversations. So we're learning, and we have learned through our conversations about looking at the intent of the rule and thinking about what ethics means for that. We talked about and learned about creating incentives for performance for both coaches and athletes. that involve performance, development, and personal learning and winning versus or winning, and cultivating an acceptance and embracing failure as a necessity to learn. So those are some of the highlights that we found in our research. And that has led us to be able to talk about how we might be able to improve some of the issues and how these issues are dealt with in athletic organizations. So that's the upshot, the summary. I'm happy to answer questions later if you'd like. If you want to read the paper, more than happy to share that with you. I'm pretty sure most of you will be like, okay, give me the summary. But that's okay. That's okay. So, as I mentioned just a second ago, this kind of an event is part of an important effort that we are making as a community to improve the way we think about athletics and ethics and compliance. So, in that spirit, I would like to introduce our moderator for today. And she is well known and is very widely respected in the athletic industry. And Dean mentioned her name. It's Miss Leah B. Olson. Leah has had a long and successful career in athletics. She played basketball for the University of Minnesota, and she studied journalism there. Then she's worked for a number of stations for a game analyst for the Minnesota Lynx, and also has been a sideline television reporter for the Timberwolves and the Lynx. She did something that I think she might mention briefly, but if not, I'm going to mention it. She founded something called Rethink the Win, which is an organization that is championing the exact kind of thing we're talking about today, positive impacts of sports beyond the game. And how do we accomplish things that are going to make our athletes even better leaders and community contributors all around the world? So it's my pleasure to welcome Leah to the podium, and we'll begin our conversation.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. This is the group that made it through the cold, wet weather, and traffic was okay. You parked, everything went well? Good, okay. Well, thank you so much for making it out today. These conversations that we're having right now in sports, I think, are probably the most important conversations that we should be having. So I'd like to thank the University of St. Thomas for doing this work. It's tremendously important, and I think we're seeing that it's incredibly important at every single level of sports. And as we value sports in this society and around the world at an incredibly high level, we value the athletes, and with that surrounds, there's money, there's stadiums, there's impact in so many different ways. And so this conversation is kind of what is the undertone of all of that. My focus with Rethink the Win right now is on a couple of levels, is that the youth sport industry has become somewhere between a $9 and $16 billion business. And with that, that has changed what we see as youth sports. So how we kind of balance that, it's not all negative, but where do we find the ethics in that and making sure that our youngest athletes are healthy and safe and can win at a high level as well. And so we're seeing that now at every single level. And so I'm really, really interested in this conversation with this amazing panel we have here today, because it really intersects at every level and as well in business. So thank you once again for having me here, and I will now introduce our esteemed panelists. So I'm going to start with, you have their bios so I'm just going to introduce them and their title, and they're going to come up. Let's start with Mr. Steve Fritz, who is the retiring Director of Athletics at the University of St. Thomas. So welcome, Steve Fritz. Give everyone a little hand. And Phil Eston, who is Athletic Director, Vice President here at University of St. Thomas. Welcome, Phil. Laura Juris, VP of People and Culture at the Minnesota Vikings. Come on up, Laura. Manny Lagos, General Manager, Sporting Director, Minnesota United. Welcome, Manny. And Christy Ferris-Oberg, who is Deputy Chief Compliance Officer at Carval Investors. Welcome, Christy. Okay, so I'm going to sneak out around you and kind of find a spot where I'm not blocking everybody to ask some questions. So let's, let me get situated here first. And you know what, let me know if I'm blocking you and I will move, so. Okay, the first question, I would like kind of everyone to talk a little bit how it affects and impacts the areas that you're working in, so we can kind of get a sense of how it crosses all levels. But how would you characterize the difference between compliance and following the rules and ethics in the work that you're doing, and how are you seeing it being impacted day in and day out? And Steve, maybe we could start with you.
Well, I think they're all intertwined. There's no question about that. But I think compliance is certainly the area that's grown the most in the period that I've been involved in athletics. Today, it's a very big part of everything. You've had to hire people specifically to do those kind of things, and following the rules is, I think, is a part of ethics. Ethics is more, I think, the people involved, the institution that you work for, everything that you do, and it's a much bigger thing, and I think compliance is, required because of some of those things and how rules have changed and how people have interpreted rules and things like that over the years. But ethics itself is just the overriding thing of everything that you do, whether it's following the rules, whether it's how you run your program, how you recruit to a program, how you fit within your institution and follow their mission and those kind of things too. So.
Phil, you want to jump in there?
Sure. Before I start, I'd like to recognize Steve. When you talk about integrity and you talk about leading programs with integrity and values, I don't know that anybody's done that better than Steve Fritz has for the last 50 years at St. Thomas, and so please join me in thanking him for what he's done. A lot of what Steve said I think is absolutely true. I think it's the difference between the what and the how. What you do is kind of the compliance and the rules, and how you do it is with integrity. And to me, that's really around hiring the right people and building a culture around integrity and making sure that we are doing things the right way. There's certainly, when you look at the spirit versus the letter of rules, there are things that you're allowed to do with the NCAA, but I think that we can all agree that you shouldn't do them. As an example, and we can talk more about this later, and I've got unfortunately several examples. You can negatively recruit all you want to all day long. There's not an NCAA rule necessarily that says you can't negatively recruit against another team, but should you do that? Without a doubt, you should not do that. And so I think that's where you might start to see, as an example, some conflict between the compliance piece and what happens on the integrity and the ethics side.
Laura, what do we see working? I know you're new to the Minnesota Vikings, but what you're seeing in your work world, yeah.
Yeah, I think, what I would add on to what has already been said, because this is such a rich topic. When you talk about the compliance world and then you go into the ethics, I kind of nail it down to where I believe my mom told me, right? It's all about your choices. And so the compliance is the guidelines that are out there, and the guardrails, combine two worlds, to try to keep you where you're supposed to be. But in our hiring process and everything we do, it's all about the choices of why we're doing it. And so from my perspective in particular, and I just left about 20 years in baseball, Major League Baseball, and switching into football, the concept still remains, and it becomes heightened on every brand that you get attached to. And so when you're hiring your people and you're trying to go through, you're looking for someone who has that ability to think strategically and ethically within the parameters, I guess I would say, on the guardrails, but I'm looking for someone who makes those good choices, because that is the aspect of whether you have a compliance policy versus what your procedural is within your culture. And that's the ongoing conversation that we have. I think daily there's always something that comes up from the business side or the sports side, where you're trying to make sure that that compliance piece is maintained and I would say held high in the choices of all the people that you have working underneath your organization.
Manny, what are your thoughts? And if you could maybe speak to what you've seen kind of over the years, if you've seen change in this area.
Sure. I think, again, a little bit more from a professional perspective. One of the things I think about when I think about compliance, and I'll probably use this theme a lot, is just the idea of how you want to kind of build a culture and environment and how you want to create something that makes everybody better and also gets them disciplined about the values you have in your organization to grow and build. And so particularly, I'm a chief soccer officer for the league, so I also represent the league. And when I look at following the rules, I also look at that role as sometimes the rules are going to evolve. I might be part of evolving the rules to push the level of the league to get better, to evolve its rules, to create an environment that I think is evolving with whatever pro sports you're in. But then ethically, again, to create an environment that I think is successful, you have to have people that want to be a part and believe in what the values of your organization are, whether it's in the front office or on the field. Everybody has to buy in and be a part of that and really believe in the league in general and the compliance of the rules that you have to follow.
And Christy, how do we see this in your field as it crosses over, and how would you experience this throughout your years?
So, I mean, I'm a little different here on this panel in that, I mean, I'm in a job with compliance in my title, right? And when I think about it, and I mean, compliance comes from you comply with the rules, right? It sort of feels defined. When we look beyond that to ethics, that is about how do we do it and who do we want to be, how do we want to define our organization, and that has to move beyond, you know, here are the rules on a piece of paper to how do we interact with each other within our organization, how do we want to interact with our constituents outside our organization. For us, that means our investors. It also means, you know, our counterparties, people that we do business with. So you've got to look beyond, I think. I mean, the rules are always changing, and we have to adapt to that. But when we're thinking about who we are as an organization and how we want to define ourselves to the people and organizations that we're interacting with, I think that it's vital to have a longer-term perspective beyond just what does the rule tell me right now I have to do. You got to be thinking ahead to what is the purpose of that rule, and are we living up to that purpose, even if we're meeting the letter of the rule, but maybe the rule is not yet evolved to the point of answering this specific issue. We've got to go back to, is this the right thing? Are we serving the spirit of the rule? Because frankly, you know, it's about reputation too, and you don't want to be the example of why the rule was changed to address something that, you know, you think, well, people should have known that this was outside the guidelines, right? Well, they didn't, so now we're going to expand the guidelines of this is where we need to stay. So I think it's critical to think about the purpose of what you're doing and who are your constituents involved there.
So how do you address just the overall, we know that for everyone on this panel, there is a thought that we want more winning and we want to make more money, and that has to be a continuous pressure, right, on both sides of that is the expectation when we come to see your teams or if I'm invested with your company. How much do you feel that pressure, the pressure to win, the pressure to make more, that then maybe has people questioning, okay, well, do we have to do it a little different? Do I have to rethink maybe some of the values that we have here if we're going to try to win like that? Maybe kind of starting from the college angle of what that looks like now.
Yeah, it's different for me in that I've spent about 20 years of my career at the major Division I level, and certainly the pressures to win and identify and grow revenues it's pretty intense. And at the Division III level, I would say that it's slightly different. We don't have the same kind of expectations to identify incremental revenues the way that you do at the Division I level, nor do we have the expectations to win as much. And for us, it's as much about the overall experience, the holistic experience. But I think what that kind of gets back to is I firmly believe that everybody behaves based on incentives. And so how we incent certain behaviors is how we're going to see people behave in whatever marketplace you define that you're in. And so clearly identifying objectives and goals on the front end is important. How are we going to measure those objectives and goals? How are we going to define success? And then how are you going to provide incentives towards those certain goals and outcomes? And I think that's where you can really start to guide culture. You know, all of us, I think you heard every single one of us mention culture. That's where you really start to develop culture. You hire the right people that you believe are going to work within the culture that you're trying to create, are going to help to uphold and advance the culture that you're trying to create. But to me, it really gets back to making sure that you identify very consistently and early on what the intended outcomes are, build incentives around those outcomes and the metrics that'll help us measure whether or not we're getting to that.
Steve, in your years here, have you seen, even though it's Division III, have you seen things change a lot as far as that pressure to win? Because I know the one thing about your men's basketball team, I expect them to win all the time.
Right, Coach Dower? Yeah, we've been very blessed, obviously, at a place like St. Thomas, that we've got an institution that's committed to being excellent on a lot of levels, you know, this downtown campus and all the good things going down here as well as on the St. Paul campus. There's a pressure to win because we do well in a lot of things, but a lot of that is internal pressure. You know, if you're going to be involved in athletics, who doesn't want to win? It's a lot more fun along that line and things like that. But as the person in charge of that kind of department, I think the crucial thing for me is we've always looked at if you get good people doing good things, you're going to get good results. So we spend a lot of time in that good people, and that's one in the hiring. You want to look for people that get it. You know, that if I always felt if I'm going to hire a person that doesn't get it, I'm going to end up doing their job, and that doesn't work. So you try to hire good people and let them go, and you certainly keep an eye on things along the line, and then it moves to the next level of recruiting good kids coming in. And if you get obviously talented kids that are good students and things like that, and you get good coaches working with good kids, you are going to get good results. But the pressure, there's certainly peer pressure, institutional pressure, league kind of things, NCAA kind of things along that line. But I would say the majority of our pressure comes from within. We got a very talented staff. They kind of there's pressure among each other in a sense. It's not a very overt one, but it's there. You know, we all want to do well, and I don't want to be the one that doesn't do well and things like that. But you certainly have to have people that you can trust that can get that job done within the rules. That's all there is to it. Otherwise, I'm not going to be very happy for a long period of time, and they're not going to be in the business very long.
Laura, I'm interested because your title is VP People and Culture. And I believe, is this a title that, I don't know if it existed 20 years ago? Is this a movement almost everyone up here has talked about evolving, that we're seeing that is now necessary and important for organizations to have?
I think it kind of hits this conversation that we're having here. I would say no, it didn't exist 20 years ago. As a human resource professional, which is really the foundation of where I'm at, it evolved into the other aspects. And again, moving beyond the policy procedure, I think, into the more dynamic world that we have today with people and how the culture affects the world. As it talks about in this conversation, really where it gets down to it for us especially, the sport is a business. And the culture that feeds that business, that interestingly plays out in the public eye at a very different angle than corporate America. Corporate America plays out. But the passion and the attacks from the outside is something that is different to deal with from the people perspective. I'm fortunate that we have a couple of our Vikings employees here listening to this conversation, so it would be interesting to hear their feedback on this. But from my tenure in sports, I guess I would say that that's that aspect of why this role continues to evolve in that fashion, is because you're trying to make everyone successful, whether it's the athlete or the front office professional, and you're dealing with dynamics not only within your organization, but from the outside inputs, right? We lose a game and the world goes crazy. The Vikings world order has all sorts of things to say. There's tweets, there's stuff on Instagram, there's pictures, and everybody is taking in that input, but we're still trying to give a consistent message of success and culture and value to those individuals that are representing us. And so, you've seen it over time. They started to call him Chief People Officer. It's evolved into that area, but I appreciate that Kevin Warren, our COO, had the vision to kind of elevate this role to say, here's where we need to operate. In this day and age, it needs to be combined in a broader term so that, and Molly's here from the HR department, it seems broader and it seems more in the supportive way that our employees and athletes need in this day and age.
Manny, can you speak a little bit about being, the newer team in town and trying to carve out that space, what that looks like as well from the more global perspective of what you're representing?
Sure. I think it's one of the fun things when I get to do talks, whether it's like this or get to kind of tell people a little about the story of Minnesota United, I always love to bring up our why. And it has a lot of personal side for me just because I love this sport. I grew up in this community. I played a lot of basketball as well and ended up really creating my livelihood both on the field for 50 years professionally and then now in this role with Minnesota United in the soccer business, in the soccer role. But the why of our club, it is to use soccer to inspire and unite the community. But when I do these talks, I throw out the soccer. It's really about inspiring and uniting the community. And really when I look at soccer, it's this massive global game, and we are just now in this country, in this state, really becoming a part of that family. And I love discussing, I love talking about how we are part of this huge global family, and the relevance of the Twin Cities of Minnesota now has grown. We had 1.1 billion hits on our first day of our game because of our stadium, because of the significance of how that stadium is designed, the story it told around the world. And with that comes a lot of the stresses of winning. With that comes the stresses not only domestically, but now we're part of this massive global family that has this passion around the world that they create their internal pressure of expectation of winning. And it's a challenge. It's a big challenge for us because we feel that weight as a club. And I always say it's a great time for us because we're just now building into how we're going to absorb and deal with that type of adversity. And that starts with our ownership group's going to absorb and deal with that. There's going to be pressures globally for them to do well and win. And then internally, from the coaching staff, there's going to be pressures to win. There's going to be pressures in our business world to create a financially viable business plan to sustain soccer as a sport that still is becoming more relevant. It still is not maybe at the top of the tier of sports in the United States. So all of that stress to me can either be looked at as a challenge and negative or can be looked at as a positive. And there's no doubt winning is a big piece of that success. It's a big piece of building your brand. And really for us, what I'm excited about is we have a chance to absorb that adversity and stress and figure out a way to make sure that we sustain a long-term viability of winning, whether it's in the business world, whether it's creating a business plan that's successful, or whether it's on the field. And really, I like these talks to say, I literally, when we sign a player and I do a contract, I try to think about from the moment we sign that player till the end, are we going to increase that asset value? And I try to encourage everybody in our organization to think about it the same way. When you hire somebody, are you going to be able to increase their asset value? Well, really the best and most effective way to do that is to make sure you have an environment culture from the time they start and when they leave you, for whatever reason, allows them to get better and become a better valued employee.
Christy, can you speak a little bit about the broader societal issues and values that may impact your business as far as trying to, is there such thing as overregulation when you're trying to do what you need to do?
Let me see if I'm getting quite at where you're going, Liam. I think we can only control what we can control, right? And I mean, as new, there are always going to be new regulations. We're not going to get away from that, and it has become more and more. And I think we've got to look at how do we manage that within the organization, not just to make sure that we comply with all the new stuff, but how are we integrating that into how we work together as an organization, and how we figure out the things that come in front of us. And on the one hand, when you've got the rules dictated from the outside, in some respects and in some instances, that can make things easier, because now you've got a bright line. This is okay, and this isn't. And this is where we don't have to debate. But the place it can make it harder is that it can sort of undermine the respect for the rules when you've got rules coming out that may be over-inclusive. There's a reason for this rule, but it's prohibiting much more than what it is just getting at. So I think it's critical in that kind of context to have ongoing conversation within the business, so that you're managing kind of that view of the rules are just rules and they're in the way and this isn't really serving our purpose, to, okay, let's figure out, we do have these things that we just got to do, but there's still going to be a lot of decision to be made about how we apply that, how we interpret certain things, and how we design our practices in order to still accomplish the business objectives. And I think that's really important, that there's that kind of conversation going on throughout the organization, because that's where you get culture, is that it's sort of spread throughout, that you don't have, oh, well, the rules, that's, I'll send that to the compliance people and they'll handle it. One of the most satisfying things for me is when I'm doing a compliance training session with people, and people ask questions, which one, I think that's absolutely critical, that people are willing to ask questions and that they're able to see where those issues are coming up. But then when someone asks a question and I don't have to answer because somebody else is answering, and it may be answering with the rule, but it may also be, but we can't, how are we going to tell our investors that, no, that doesn't feel right? We can't do that because it's not the right thing to do. So I think, from the broader context, yeah, there's a lot of regulation going on, and we're in a highly regulated business. You can try to influence that, I suppose, through different organizations. But when it comes down to it, I think our energies are best focused on what we control and how we kind of manage that environment internally.
Well, Phil, could you speak, because I think you mentioned that you may have some examples of when we see the ethics and compliance kind of intersecting. What would be some examples we might see in college?
I'll give you one. Prior to coming back to the University of St. Thomas, I spent 4.5 years at Penn State as the Deputy Director of Athletics and Chief Operating Officer. And just before I got there, you all may recall some events that happened at Penn State that put Penn State pretty front and center in media nationally. And we call them the events of 2011. Nobody refers to them as the S word, the scandal word. But, shortly after Jerry Sandusky was arrested and Coach Paterno was removed from his role, the NCAA came in and put some sanctions onto Penn State from a recruiting standpoint and a scholarship standpoint, and they allowed their student athletes to transfer without penalty. And so one of the rules in NCAA right now, or at that time, it's changed since then, but at that time is if you transferred as a student athlete to another Division I institution, you had to sit out for 1 year. And so the NCAA actually lifted that restriction on transfers from student athletes at Penn State to other institutions. And so it really became kind of a free-for-all for other institutions to start recruiting from Penn State's roster for a year or two to try to get those student athletes to, I'm going to say, defect from Penn State to another institution, either in the Big Ten or some other school across the nation. And you know, you think about what happened from a legal perspective at Penn State, and that's a conversation completely separate from the fact that we've got student athletes who did nothing wrong, who now are being, there's a sanction on them, they can't go to postseason, they may have some ideas about whether or not they want to continue to compete at Penn State or not. And you have coaches from across the country flying to State College, camping outside of the locker room, waiting for them to leave the locker room so that they can recruit them to try to come to their particular institution. Not against the rules, right? Because the NCAA did say, hey, look, we're going to allow you to transfer without penalty. You don't have to sit out a year. Negative recruiting is not legislated with the NCAA, but I think that's a perfect example of where the ethics of doing what you're doing and the compliance rules collided, and there was definitely conflict, in my opinion. And fortunately, you know, I'll say that the integrity of some of those student athletes who had decided to represent Penn State for their careers, the vast majority of them stayed at Penn State. And so I think it's that example kind of gives you an example of where compliance and ethics and integrity all kind of hit in the sweet spot or not. The perfect or imperfect storm of all of those things kind of coming together. Unfortunately, we see things like that play out in college athletics and professional athletics time and time again. I think that's just one example that I believe illustrates all of those things together.
So Laura and Manny, if you could both address this, is that so as an organization, you have a set of values and mission statements and things that represent your unique organizations, but of course you're bringing in people from all over the country and all over the world, and obviously humans are humans, you can't vet every single piece, but how important is that process of trying to vet out athletes to match your organization, yet obviously skill set and winning being a huge piece of it?
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with that one. It's incredibly important. You know, I think we have a process, you know, of trying to really not only identify the player for their talent and what they're going to bring on the field, but also if they fit the culture. It's a sales job. There's no doubt about it. And again, as I think about the Twin Cities and the uniqueness of our market, we're not necessarily a big market like LA or New York, but we're not necessarily a small market like, say, for example, Portland or Kansas City. So it really helps to have a community like this to kind of talk about and tell the story for a lot of our global players that we try to sign, and not only talk about the values within our organization, but the values now within the community that they're going to receive when they come here. And we tend to actually sign older players, either who are looking to kind of raise their young kids, or we get younger players. We don't always sometimes get the biggest superstars in the mid-20s because they do gravitate towards a different maybe lifestyle than the Twin Cities offers. But ultimately, the character assessment is very hard, and it's really an honest one where you're not going to always get it right. And again, the part about that I like, though, is that it's okay to get that piece wrong, as long as you really push and build an environment where that can create behavior change, and if you get the character assessment wrong. So, and sometimes you won't, and sometimes, especially in pro sports, you have to be ruthless. You have to put your hand up and say you made mistakes, or you have to say we haven't built a strong enough cultural environment to help build and grow this athlete, to increase his asset, to increase the winning for the team. And ultimately, I think both of those two sides are very important. Both are important to say, hey, we got it wrong, we have to get better at that process. But also we can always say, did our culture and environment it help grow and increase that player's behavioral tendencies?
And Laura, have you seen this in baseball and with the Vikings?
Yeah, I was just going to say, my experience, I still kind of put to a basic level. I mean, there is a component, recruiting is hard on any level. When you get to the sports component, and we just recently went through a very well-publicized process in the NFL, right, the draft, to kind of go through, and even going back to the combine, when I first came into football, Rick Spielman and was nice enough to kind of give me my education and really talked about it and said it's like speed dating. We have 15 minutes with these guys and we're going to go through all these questions and try to figure this out. But there is a character component that's still important. We're still trying to find those athletes, and in my experience in baseball is the same way. The really challenging part to me beyond from between sport and business, I guess I would say, is that you're looking for the character for the athlete themselves. And then you're looking to see how that athlete combines into the culture of that team as it goes. I mean, athletes have a much better insight to this than I do. I can't say I was ever an athlete that way. But we had a great story recently where Anthony Barr had way more money to go someplace else, and he decided to come back to us. And that was a great story for the whole organization. It was a story worldwide, just because, even internally, amongst our executives, we're sitting there one day and then all of a sudden everybody's phone starts beeping and they said, wait, what happened? Wait, he's coming back. And, it's that kind of a dynamic that it's hard to quantify or necessarily create, truthfully, because as much as we would have tried, and we obviously did and did a good job, you're having money dangled at a rate that is hard to fathom for most of us. And to have them say, and literally that was the quote, is that he just woke up and said, this doesn't feel right. And then when I get the privilege to go behind the scenes and talk to some of those executives to say, why did that happen? What was there? And, you're talking to the agent, you're talking to the person. The person was just saying, I felt like this was there. And so, I don't know if that totally answers in that same way, but I think that that's just an interesting characteristic when you're talking about interviewing and trying to say, here's the values, here's who we are, and here's why we think you'll be successful here. It's not just you as a person. And it's not, as we've talked about, this aspect of making them grow successfully, but it's also saying how successfully can they link with the other members of the team already. And that chemistry is fragile, very fragile.
Steve, how would you say that experience in sports kind of lays the foundation for leadership, both in sports but in business as well?
Well, on a daily basis, if you're involved in athletics, there's just going to be so many things, from teamwork, hard work, networking, preparation, all those kinds. And sports is not the only way you can get that. Not everybody can be blessed enough to have the talent to play in an athletic team, whether it's on a youth level, high school level, college level, and things like that. So you can certainly pick those things up, but it's magnified in the sports world because you're so visible. And but on a daily basis, you're going to experience those kind of things, whether it's within your own team. If you're a coach, it's within your own program and your institution and those kind of things. So there's just no question that, and that's why it's so important as individuals that they can, the people you are around know where you're coming from, know what you stand for, and you do have to show it on a daily basis, whether it's referring to the basics of rules or it's how you run your program or how you oversee a program. And the people that you work with have to know where you're coming from, know what you're expecting. And if you don't show that on a daily basis, people are going to see right through you. We're blessed, obviously, to work with college kids that are 18 to 22 years old. What a very impressionable time of life. They not only have the good things that they're being involved in athletics, but so many other things in their lives at that time. It's the first time they're on their own, away from their parents. They're making a lot of decisions and things like that. And they are looking to you and other people. And but a nice thing at a place like the University of St. Thomas is the mission statement talks about providing the opportunity for our students to think critically, act wisely for the common good. And if that doesn't fit with athletics, I don't know what does. To get our, if you're going to be successful on the court or field of play and things like that, if you can't get your kids to think critically and act wisely, you're in trouble. So it's so intertwined with all that they're doing at that level or at that age.
Christy, what would you say as far as recruitment of people in your industry? Do you look at athletes in that way, or do you have a totally different way of kind of vetting out what would be a better fit in your industry?
I think, as Steve said, those kinds of elements do show up, but it could be a lot of different things, but something that has shown that someone has focus and drive and discipline to be committed to something. I wouldn't say that from what I've experienced in my particular role, I haven't seen something specific there. But one other skill that I would add to Steve's list is resilience. And I say this not being an athlete myself, but it seems to me that as good as you are at winning, you're going to lose too. And you have to be able to recover from that. And particularly when you're looking at, the small wins and losses within a game, you got to recover quickly if you're going to be able to move forward. And I think that is a critical skill in business too, to keep yourself focused on the end goal and to recover from the stumbles along the way.
What would you say, and this is for all of you on the panel, would be what the expectation is from all of you for leadership in our community because of the way that we do value sports in this country? Does that put you at us in a different space of expectations of leadership, of how you may need to present yourselves in your industries?
Go ahead, Phil.
Sorry.
Oh, I think without a doubt that it does. Sports is the first reality TV show when you think of it. When you think about how popular reality TV shows are, it's because it happens in real time and we're watching real life things unfold in front of us. And I think one of the reasons the sports is so intriguing to people is because there's strong affinity and emotion, and it's reality TV. And because of the strong affinity and emotion and how interested we all are in our particular team or what happens publicly, it brings us all together. We're also interested in the ups and the downs, and everybody kind of watches that unfold over time. And so I think without a doubt, our lives, from a leadership standpoint, some more than others, play out in public. And so I know it's important for me from a parental standpoint. I've got 3 kids, and I want them to know that I'm doing my job with integrity. And I think it's important for our student athletes to know that we're doing our jobs with integrity, and we're as much in a mentorship role as we are in a leadership role. Maybe in college athletics more so than professional athletics, but I don't know. I've never worked in professional athletics. And so, the short answer to your question, I think without a doubt it's really important that we remember we've got a responsibility, an important responsibility, to do our work with a great level of integrity. Because if we don't, people are watching, and it does catch up with you, and I don't think you can sustain success any other way.
I was just going to say, and I think, and I like what Mandy said earlier about it's the unity aspect of where you are. I mean, the Minnesota United story is brilliant with the combination of people. And, part of what the professional sports, I think, switch is really that aspect of the dollars, is people publicly know how much people are being paid, and they look at it and they say, oh, you have this fancy new stadium, you have all of these pieces. And so there is an expectation to say, you know what, we're contributing, we're emotionally tied into you, and then we expect you to give back to this community that you work and live in, and we will give back to you, and that's how that partnership works. But I loved that presentation to say that's really what it is, and I 100% believe. And my whole career in professional sports, I think that's been presented to me in that setup to say, as an ambassador of this amazing sport that people are tied to, this is what your expectation is. And here's why, and here's how it's going to come back. And again, ultimately, it is a business. But the value of where we are is a huge component. Most sports teams have professional foundations, and they have other areas, and their community relations team is a critical part of that organization as another kind of ambassador out into the community. It's not necessarily the athlete, that's usually the cool part. But I will say, like even here, when we come, people are like, oh, you work for the Vikings, I'm not an athlete, but I'm representing what we have to do and how we contribute.
Manny, how would you say how difficult it is to be open and transparent in your business when it is a business, but obviously so visible, everyone watching every step and possible misstep?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, transparency, because it really touches a lot of areas of both your internal culture and then your external culture about how you present yourself in the community and the public at large. And I would say uniquely and internally, to try to build that environment and culture that you want, transparency is so important to create not only a level of trust within your organization, but make sure, again, as you're trying to make everybody better within an organization, allowing people to be transparent about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it is incredibly important. It's incredibly empowering, to be honest, to really push that message. Externally, it's a lot harder in professional sports to try to really navigate how you want to push the public perception of what you want to talk about and don't want to talk about. And it's interesting because I'm way above my pay grade in terms of when you get into the business world. But MLS, if you really want to take a deep dive into the uniqueness of the business structure, it is a insanely unique business structure. It's a single entity business structure where the owners run the league out of New York, and all the players are owned by the league, actually, and then are distributed to the franchises. And so technically, even though I do all the contract work, all the negotiations, they're actually, the final contract is signed by the league out of New York, and they're paid out of New York. And I bring that up, it creates a ton of compliance and regulation areas that we have to think about. And we're in this amazing growth period for the league and stadiums and investment. And we are at a pivotal moment in terms of the league, in terms of like, where is the timing of deregulating some of the stuff we're doing, while we're growing so fast, there's so much investment that we're going to have to need more regulation, because it is a global game. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes dealings to try to get the best value you can for players and acquisitions. So it really, to me, it's unique to be in this meeting, because I hope as you guys start to learn about the sport of soccer, not only on the field, but just also the growth of MLS. And it's a little bit different than the other sports. We are not the best league in the world. There's no doubt about it. We are growing into the top 10, which is a huge accomplishment, I think, for soccer in the world. But there's certainly leagues within Europe that are really financially doing really well. And so our challenge is to try to get up to that level, while also trying to deal with creating a financially viable business plan that deals with compliance, that deals with how do you push the envelope to I would say in my world, to try to deregulate some of the things, while we still kind of have the values that will make the league great in the long run.
What would you say is and I don't know if pressure is the right word, that you may be feeling from how young people are entering college now, or for how athletes are, their expectations when they get to professional sports, or your clients? Has it changed? Is there a different expectation now for students coming into the school of what they want and how they receive it?
I don't think there's any question about it. That's one of the interesting things from the kind of things that Phil and I do at the college level. Things is people always ask you, do you know all the student athletes? Well, we have 750, so it's pretty hard to get to know them all on some level. And it's one of the things that's kind of fun is you look at the football team and you look at a hockey team, the people who wear helmets. And then you try to figure out who's who when you see them off the field. You forget sometimes how young these kids are. And I'm sure the same thing, everybody expects you're playing professional football, you're wearing that beard, you're a big, and they take those helmets off, and you see a lot of baby faces and young people, and it's amazing. The women's hockey team, everybody wears a ponytail, so everybody looks about the same, and then they get out of their skates, and you forget they're not very big and things too. But they do come to us different than they did, and Christy made a great point again about, and I meant to mention that too, about one of the things about athletics is getting knocked down and getting back up, and that is attractive. But these days, you don't see kids that play multiple sports all the way through. You get so specialized so early. I mean, I have a 7-year-old grandson that's playing hockey, and that's about all he's playing these days. And you keep trying to say, let's swim, let's get into this, let's get into that. Because growing up, there is something to take from being involved in everything along that line, and also other things in school and things like that. And I'm not so sure that specialization is so great. They've been given a lot of things that, man, should you have that at this? They've traveled a lot. They've done a lot of things that are very hard to overcome when you get to the high school level and at the college level a lot of times too. So it's a very different world they're coming out of these days.
And would you say for young professional athletes that you're seeing a different athlete coming through with maybe a higher expectation of how the league will serve them?
Well, maybe I'll talk about my other industry because then it's easier that way. And I probably, honestly, because I have more history from baseball, but I will say, you know, I was fortunate to work with some of the amazing legends in baseball. So Al Kaline from the Detroit Tigers, and then, you know, no one can say they don't know Hank Aaron. And when you hear their stories from when they started and where they went through, there was no agent, there was no someone that you had to talk to, there was no nutritionist, there was no strength coach, there was all these things. And recently even Hank Aaron just did a interview with ESPN and was just talking about, like, no one told me how I was supposed to hold my bat. I didn't have all these specialized coaches. And now, because they are specialized in when they come up, they have grown up with their entourage. And then when they come in, there's your entourage that you're providing as a team. You know, so that happened in baseball, that happens in football for sure. You know, there's a special teams group, there's, you know, extra coaches, there's all these other things that are there. And so, you know, I think it's a different dynamic. And I think even when you're talking to the, I would say the sports side of the house, they're trying to make sure that that dynamic works in addition to, you know, as recently as yesterday, we had a conversation about, you know, mental skills coaching, which, you know, again, back in the day, didn't exist. And now it's all part of this whole entire package, and we're saying we're doing it to make you successful, but the competitive advantage going to one sport to another is to say, look at our amazing new facility that we have. We have the, you know, cryotherapy chamber at TCO, right? So that is a different resource expectation than what happened, you know, even 10 years ago, 5 years ago to some extent.
Manny, would you say that we're seeing a better athlete come through? And we talked about specialization, but and this might be different in soccer because I don't think that we've caught up to the rest of the world in this country in soccer yet, but would you say that specialization, there is some advantages to that, or do you really see athletes needing to be in different sports?
Oh, it's a great question. I would start with one of the things we're doing well in this league because of the push by the other pro sports is our facilities and the sports science. And I think that's a positive in the long run. I really do. I think the ability to service your athletes and get them to think about their bodies as a value and to build and become stronger and fitter. And I think in that area, it's really positive. I do. And I think it pushes your staff to think about how you can you know, make a better individual, by making better decisions, he'll become a better value and asset to the club. And really, in my world, I say, and increase his value means more money. He'll make a lot more money in his career if he kind of embraces those values. But it's really interesting because, Leah, you mentioned first your organization and talking about integrity and youth and this $9 to $15 billion industry. And that plays a big role in development because now that money is now involved in how we develop our athletes and how we go about giving them pathways to become professional athletes. And that's a challenge because sometimes that doesn't necessarily go with the end pathway in terms of what we want. And again, when we talk about resiliency, I love that you use that. I just think about the unfairness of sports. I think about in soccer, we have 28 rostered players. I only have 18 players that can travel and suit up on game days. Only 11 can play. And so every day, every week, they are dealing with the unfairness of something that they want and want to do. And that, to me, is a little bit like life. You know, sometimes, you know, we want to try to make it be this easy pathway, but it has a nice reminder that life is unfair, and really how you're going to deal with that. I mentioned adversity. You mentioned failure. It really kind of is a nice moments to kind of continually in sports to think about how you're going to deal with that, not just for yourself individually, but also then for the collective good. And I think that resonates with business as well, because ultimately when you find employees that want to try to put the business or the team ahead, even though you're individually not doing well, you'll find the group as a whole kind of brings down the bottom. Just to bring up the youth sports piece, it's a challenge. I mean, I can tell you guys from the youth soccer development world, it has become a massive business, and it's coming to the U.S., and it's coming fast. The biggest clubs in the world, Barcelona, now has offices in New York, Bayern Munich. They're looking at our youth soccer industry about how can they be a part of grabbing all these kids that are playing soccer and developing them. And ultimately, we actually aren't developing as many young pro American soccer players as we'd like right now. And a lot of it has to do with all the money in the sports business. And we're really trying at a higher level, take a deep breath and say, we have all this participation, but it's not leading to high level American soccer players. So I think a lot of what Steve mentioned is a part of that, we maybe are not allowing the kids to grow into the passion side of the sport, the love in the sport via participating in other sports. But it's going to be a big challenge because the level and the activity of development and the amount of hours needed now to play at these high levels is pretty intense. It really becomes a challenging situation to navigate whether a single sport is the appropriate pathway or multiple sports.
And before I open it up, I was just thinking we can go down the panel and maybe talk about where we think the future is going in the direction of compliance and ethics, and do we see some positive things coming through that may allow us to navigate this world a little bit better, or would you say we're maybe headed into some gray areas that as we're moving through and we have higher expectations, we're having college scandals, kids, everything seems to be a little more intense now and competitive in the world that we live in. Do you see, if you can just think of your industry, what it may look like in the future as kind of the battle with compliance and ethics? Mm-hmm. I'll start with you, Christy.
Wow, that's a big
boy question.
Wow. Regulation's not going to drop off. And I think from my perspective, we just have to continue to work towards not letting compliance be compartmentalized, that there's got to always be conversation to acknowledge that rules may appear to conflict with business objectives at times, and to get over that. I think it's just critical to maintain communication about that. People have to be ready and willing to ask questions and raise issues. So we've got to educate within our organizations to keep that happening. And that's going to be demanded of us not only from the regulators, but from our investors. And that is also the ongoing conversation that really, I think, feeds that ethics piece, and for our organization makes it real, because we're dealing with investors that are making large investments, and they're going to vet those very carefully. So they're in our offices, and they're meeting with people from various departments, and they're asking questions, and they're imposing standards, and they want to know that we're with them and doing right by them all the time. So I think it's just to maintain that communication and to be aware of that ongoing demand for transparency. And I think that one of the things, as Manny mentioned, is that the transparency within your organization is critical as well. And part of as I've seen that be a priority in my organization in recent years from the leadership, one of the things that I think that feeds is a common sense of purpose, a common ability to look beyond what's right in front of us to kind of the longer life of the organization and maintaining relationships over a longer period of time.
Well, Phil, maybe I'll jump to you since you're taking over and you're kind of probably been looking at years to come here. Do you, it's probably neither positive, negative, probably just different as we evolve?
Yeah, you know, what comes to mind, kind of the phrase that comes to mind for me with this question is evolution by revolution. In that, you know, I think that change is really hard for people to imagine, especially if they can't get over imagining the fact that what you have should change. It's difficult to envision what it would look like ultimately once that particular change occurs. And I think we're in a marketplace and an industry where change is inevitable. And so it doesn't mean that you can't still hold on to the same values that help to create the successes that you have today. But maybe in the future we might do it a little bit differently because we've got to evolve with different generations, different marketplace expectations, different compliance regulations, whatever it might be. And I think that's something we just have to accept. You know, from a generational perspective, it's easy to stereotype and generalize some certain things on today's generation that's coming into the marketplace. And I'll give you one example. And I think sometimes we hear that people believe that today's generation entering the marketplace doesn't have the same kind of work ethic that other generations have had. And I don't believe that. I believe that the definition of work ethic has changed in this particular generation. And so it doesn't mean that it's right, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it means that we have to kind of reshift and refocus what we believe our ultimate work ethic is, and is that even an important word that we're going to use anymore, because that common vernacular is an important part of culture. And so as we think about tomorrow, it doesn't mean that we can't continue to keep yesterday's values, but we might think about it a little bit differently, particularly as we're looking at an incoming generation of student athletes that's very different from the generation of student athletes that I competed with or that Steve competed with, and you know, there's a lot of differences there. And so again, I think that's how we all have to think about our work, is how do we adapt? Because frankly, you know, I agree that regulatory issues aren't going to change, and regulation around what we do isn't going to change, but we can't expect people to come to us, right? We talk a lot about, you know, we wake up every single day and I have an intention of how I want to go about my day. And other people perceive how I'm going about my day. And oftentimes there's a gap between that intention and perception. It's my responsibility to close the gap. It's not their responsibility to close the gap. So it's our responsibility to try to go to our generation of student athletes, not expect them to come to us.
And Manny, maybe just a quick piece on, as you kind of talked about the future of your sport, where do you think?
Well, it's a good question if we're really talking about pro sports in this room. And we're talking about Minnesota, if we're being honest. I think, you know, we're going to have a generation here of expectation of more winning within all of our organizations, because it's been a little bit of a down period. And I think, again, I think it can be healthy and I think it can be positive, but it certainly is going to be, I think, with a lot of the new stadiums being built and a lot of the franchises, I think, not living up to that expectation of winning right now, there's going to be a lot of stress and pressure on the professional organizations in the market to deal with that. And I actually think Minnesotans should push that pressure. I mean, we actually, outside the market, have a little bit of being a little bit too soft. And I think there has to be a balance of pushing that line that maybe we can do a better job of pushing how we follow the rules, but also pushing to evolve and make sure that we expect to win more. And we still do it the right way, but we also put it on ourselves as, in this community, in this market, I always say we live on an island. You know, it's a really challenging market to develop that kind of intensity of expectation of winning. So I'm not sure where it's going to go, but I think it's going to be more stressful than we realize, because there has been a lot of investment from the community, into a lot of these stadiums, into these facilities. And I think the fans, in a good way, positive way, I think going to want more winning because we haven't felt it for a while.
And Laura, I'll end with you in that the power of the NFL, the Vikings, the NBA or the NFL draft had better ratings than NBA playoffs. So when you make a move, the state moves. What do you feel? How that looks for you in the future is kind of wielding that power, but then also knowing the responsibility of what you have there.
That's a big question. I will say, because I agree with Manny, I think there is increased pressure and focus on, we have this amazing new stadium, we have amazing new practice facility, and kind of where that goes. I think the output and the result is really where we're going to continue to have to focus. The leadership retreat is next week for the Minnesota Vikings, just a little heads up for everyone. So, and in that's what we're trying to figure out is what is our future and how are we contributing and what is that definition of success as we had talked about from before. And so, especially being new to the organization, for some of you that don't know, I literally have been there about 6 months. I have been impressed with the sense of strong innovation and change and revolution and how are we looking at things. And so what I envision for the future is this is an identity shift. For my folks that are here, they've heard me say this. This is a transition of who we are, and even, not beyond where we physically live, but how we interact and what we do. And there's a lot of things that I feel like are being thrown on the wall, and we're seeing what's going to stick. And then it will come down. And there's two parts of it. There's one that's a sports side, and then for some of you that know, within our world, we have a mixed-use property around us, which is kind of a new sports revenue business. And so expectations are high across the board. I don't know if I answered the question in the exact same way, but it's one that, especially as this conversation goes, I'm probably just lost in thought a little bit on a few different areas, thinking I love what everyone says. And I think that is our constant challenge, is to stay relevant and resilient as these changes are going almost at a lightning pace with technology.
Well, let's put our hands together for this amazing panel. Pretty interesting stuff. And now we're going to take it out to the audience. I'm hoping someone from a younger generation is going to pop in with some questions here. Okay, so Michelle's going to run around with the mic. Here you go.
I haven't gotten enough exercise today, so here we go.
So thank you very much to all the panelists and to Ms. Leah Olson for moderating. I just have a question for the women in the panel. I'm wondering if for sports that the odds are kind of stacked against women, and whether women need to take or are tempted to take shortcuts sometimes. How do you... is this the case? And then how do you kind of deal with keeping your integrity and moving forward in compliance with rules, but in an ethical way?
I'm not sure I'm quite following the question.
I think actually even, Christy, if you can take a look at from a female perspective, when we're looking at female leaders, are there some shortcuts that are needing to take place to compete in that world?
Okay, so you mean sort of more pressure?
I think so. I think so. Right.
I don't know that I have experienced that particularly around the rules. I mean, I think that one of the things that women face in business generally is that when you are fewer, when there are fewer women around, it may be more difficult for your voice to be heard. So there may be that piece of, I think, as a person who has to put forth what the rules are and voice, this doesn't work this way, let's look for a different way. I think that there is a process of finding your voice and how to do that and maintain establish credibility with people, and that may be different just based on how men and women communicate or how we as a culture are used to hearing those voices. So I'm not sure if I quite got to your question, but I guess that's what I've experienced and perceived.
In the world of athletics, how do we see that? I know I feel very fortunate to have some friends and fabulous leaders on the panel and in this room. Steve, you led the way with Title IX. Would there be some ways that you can point to females in athletics and how they've had to step up to the plate?
Well, I think they've been in probably a greater fishbowl than men have, because people are, examining their programs and, finding out who's successful. It's hard, We've got some great examples. Sheila's our women's soccer coach. The thing I'm very proud about on our staff is Sheila has 5 kids, and our women's basketball coach has 4 kids, and they've been able to balance, the lives at home and being very successful with their programs and things like that. But they're in a fishbowl. There's no question. I think there's a lot of things assumed on the men's side that the women. A lot of it because of timing and where programs have come from, and they are different. Sheila knows that a men's program probably can have 40 kids because kids will stay out. Where a women's program, if they're not playing, they're gone. They're not going to play a JV program or this or that. So that's very different. And but I think there's also some great opportunities for women out there right now too, and things like that, because people do want to be coached by women and have good examples of what things can be in life and things like that. So, but I think it's very difficult for them too and things like that. But it's such a great area to work in and things like that I think it's such a good opportunity.
And Michelle, I was going to say, I'd like
Thanks,
to comment on that
that'd
one
be
in
great.
particular, because I think, I don't know as I would say that there's shortcuts. I definitely agree that there is a fishbowl mentality, and I think there's an aspect, there's a great part, and it's not just women. There's a diversity across the board that's causing a different education on how you're looking with people. So as you're talking about if you are a female leader, and I literally had this conversation yesterday, if one of our women is a scout and she gets married and she has kids, like what happens? There's an education to that process, and I feel like there is the fishbowl effect of I have to maybe explain more about my personal life and aspects than men ever had to. And I say that as a general, not as an offense. And it's just different. And so what I would say is it's not necessarily a shortcut, but I feel strongly as a female executive in sports that there is a different sense of advocacy that's needed. And it's with the men that are in the area and trying to figure out, and it's not necessarily a shortcut, but there's a different navigation because you are unique. You're the one person that's there, and every day there's some first woman doing something. And when you look at it and you hear their stories and you talk to them, there is the entourage of people that are there. And most often, obviously, because especially in sports, they're very male dominated, they're the male advocates who have helped assign people in there. Within the Vikings in particular, it's very well known that Kevin Warren is a huge advocate of women and tries to pull that in. But it takes that kind of collective group to see that. So not necessarily a shortcut, but it's one that I would definitely say it's necessary and needed because of, as Steve said, the fishbowl that's there and having to kind of reveal everything that I need because people don't know what you need sometimes.
Great. We have some special guests back here, Minnesota Amateur Sports Commission, which we're excited to have.
Thank you. So I'm, as a former Big Ten football player and a current master's in public health, I look at sports as a public health asset. And knowing that team sport participation is on the decline. If you look at Leah's website, she has a stat that said 70% of 13-year-olds that quit sports, it's due to not having fun. And that's your pipeline as well as college and professional and sports professionals. Do you see any ethical burden as sports leaders to change sports or affect things at the youth level to increase participation, whether from building your pipeline or as a public health asset here in our country?
You know, I'll start
Good
it, and I
question.
see my responsibility there more as a father than I do as a sports leader. You know, I've got three kids, all of whom participate in different activities. Some more in organized team sports, and others in individual sports or kind of fitness-oriented things. And you know, I played baseball at St. Thomas. I didn't play well, but I was on a team, and I know the only reason I had the ability or the opportunity to play is because I played a lot as a kid. Well, the only reason I play a lot as a kid is because I had fun. And as I watch my kids kind of get into their little leagues and youth soccers and dance and mountain biking and skiing, it's really important for me, again, as a father, to make sure that they're having fun. And we all, I think, lament kind of around our days of playing youth sports, and it's more political today than it was when I was a kid, and there's more involved in it. It's more competitive, it's more specialized, there's more travel, whatever it might be. And you know, maybe because I do know the end game more than others know, but I take it upon myself to try to insert appropriately when I can, and you have to be careful, but when I can, to make sure that we're having fun. Because if you don't have fun, you're going to quit. If you don't have fun, you're not going to play, and you're not going to develop the skills that you need to play at the next level. And so if I think about youth sport or youth activity, because I've got one son who is not involved in athletics, but loves to mountain bike and ski, and is in Boy Scouts, so he loves to camp and do some outdoors things, and he's having a blast doing those things. And it's outside of the formal structure of sport, which is really fun to watch. That was not me when I was growing up. And so it's really fun to watch, and it's important for me to try to make sure that the other two are having fun, so they continue to do it from a health perspective, but also so they continue to do it so they can develop, should they want to do that at some other level.
I think I'd say I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because nobody could have had more fun than I've had over the last 52 years. But I was listening to the Twins broadcast the other night, and they were talking about the value of bringing in Nelson Cruz. And he said he talks to mostly the young players, and he always talks to before they go up to bat is, do you have a plan? But he also asks them at the end of it, did you have fun with it when they come back and things like that? So it's having fun is certainly a big part of things.
It's a really tough one from a professional answer. I would say, particularly in soccer, it's such a hot topic because our national team on the women's side is world champions and doing really well, and we've created an environment in this country that is very supportive and really has risen to the top of the food chain in terms of success. On the men's side, we're way down low, but we have this massive league growing. We have all this talent coming in from all the world. We do have some really good stories. We actually had a player sold for $70 million he was developed in this country, but he went to Germany and was then sold to England this year, so it's the highest transfer ever for an American player. But in the bigger thing, we're not having as many American players in the MLS and on the field. And it's funny, I think about the word, we bring up coaches' education, and really, I think it starts with the 5 to 12-year-old age group, and it's actually not the coach's part. I think it's the education part. And it's really, I think, getting back to getting people who get kids excited about the experience of whatever they're doing and enjoying that aspect of it. And then from that, if there's a baseline of the talent level, the technical level, and then that passion or fun level, really the key development years from 13 to 17 can really be accentuated if they're going to a much higher level, the pro level, or if they're going to the baseball level where they're combining it with school. So I would be remiss, though, if I wasn't at this to talk about soccer is so uniquely different, and we are going to have some massive challenges in this country to think about the combination of education and development. And what I mean by that, in the global world, the players are kind of looked upon as like a valuation of a stock market. Their biggest value tends to be between 18 and 20 years old. In this country, that is our collegiate athletic participation development pathway of both education and on the field. And it's coming in soccer. We have to, accentuate how we're going to push the development of players from 14 to 17, and then push them out into for hopefully their benefit, into the global professional market where they're being, sold or not sold, but they're being offered high-level contracts that, are an alternative to the collegiate experience, and hopefully they will still take a collegiate experience. But it just brings up another question: what happens between 14 and 17? How are they being developed? How are they being, continue their education, continue to push it? It's a really, in my world, it's a really challenging one to kind of dissect, because again, in the global world, it's a little more ruthless. It's a little bit more, the markets that these kids tend to come from, they're trying to get out of somewhere. We've created a great community here where we like being here. We like this community. So it's a challenge, definitely a challenge. And I think it's going to be a big challenge for all of us, whether it's in the pro sports or the collegiate level, to think about how the kids are being developed to participate in our entities.
Great, we'll take two more.
Good morning. I know that sports, especially professional sports, has an interesting culture around unwritten rules. And I'm wondering if you have any comments around how the perceived integrity of players or coaches, around whether they follow those unwritten rules, and their reputation as players, as sportsmen, and their sportsmanship in the league. Thinking about things as simple as like dropping down a bunt on a pitcher who's competing for a no-hitter, or even continuing to compete at your top level when the score is lopsided. What kind of ethical decision-making goes along with that?
It's a baseball question first, right?
Yeah, Paul, I think that's meant for you.
Yeah.
Baseball's got a book of unwritten rules. I think there are quite a few of them, and I think that's part of the culture and the history of the game, which is kind of, there's a neat part to that. Another one is if somebody shows up your pitcher, or somebody hits a home run on you or whatever, are you going to throw high and tight in the next pitch? And there are several of those unwritten rules in baseball. I think there are a few in soccer too. And I say sarcastically, I think there's quite a few in soccer. I absolutely think that's around creating a culture on your team, and what does your team stand for? To me, we talk a lot in our athletic department here and at other places that I've been about brand, and that's kind of something that you own, and that reputation is really important. And what do we do to continue to push out our brand into the marketplace? It's how you act, it's how you respond, and all these sorts of things. And I think talking around and through some of those unwritten rules, or how you behave on the field, is really important. A really quick story: when I was at Penn State, again after the events of 2011, it was really a brand building exercise for us. And our football team, the first couple of years that I was there, we went to the Pinstripe Bowl as a 7-6 team, and then we went to the Gator Bowl as a 7-6 team. And that next year we exploded. And you might remember Penn State played in the Rose Bowl against USC. And those of you that follow college football and follow the Rose Bowl that year, it was really a fun football game. It was the longest football game in the history of the Rose Bowl, the highest scoring football game in the history of the Rose Bowl. It's also colder than any other time in the Rose Bowl. But at the last minute, USC wins on a last-second field goal. And our football coach, James Franklin, doesn't like to hear me say this, but I think the best thing that happened to Penn State's brand is that we lost that football game. Because if we won, the national story would have been around the fact that Penn State football is back. And it would have been, Joe Paterno days kind of led to this, and football rules again, and it's all around kind of football winning at Penn State. Instead, the story was around the culture and character of the team. A couple things happened in that particular game. There was injuries on both sides. So when our guy was injured, we had a senior linebacker who was injured in the end zone of a football game. It was the very last game he's ever playing. And while he's laying on the field injured, their guys were kind of on the sidelines, dancing to the music, kind of being played at the timeout, whatever, not really paying attention. One of their guys goes down, and our entire team took a knee and waited for him to get up. And that's just one example. End of the game, they hit the last-second field goal, and their entire team runs to our student section and celebrates in front of our student section, kind of taunting the student section, while our guys walk to center field to the midfield to shake hands. And so then all of a sudden the national conversation began to take place around the culture change at Penn State and what was happening from a character standpoint at Penn State and how we were playing, not that we were winning. And I think in the long run, man, it hurt to lose that game. And all of us wanted to win that game as much as anything. In the first month or two afterwards, it was very difficult to try to recover and move on. However, in the long run, from a brand perspective, the best thing that happened, I think, to Penn State football was that we lost the Rose Bowl the way that we lost the Rose Bowl.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say.
No,
I think part of it is the conversation, especially in the context of what we're talking about today, is the resilience of it. And there's a zillion unwritten rules everywhere. And it's important to have a culture to be able to discuss those unwritten rules. And that's where it is. It's in the aftermath. How are you addressing it? If there is you plunked the hitter because they're doing something, there's some, weird latent hit on a quarterback. It's the aftermath, I think, that really becomes the story in a lot of cases. Is you heard there was an unwritten rule, you saw there was an unwritten rule, and then how does your culture respond? How are you talking about it, and is it open for your culture to have that conversation about why that is an unwritten rule?
Yeah, I would just add, I think they evolve. I actually like unwritten rules from the. I don't like that they're out there, but I like when they happen. I like when they happen because it creates dialogue. It also reminds you that you can have this cultural environment, but actually every day it has to be addressed and it has to be strived for to improve and evolve. And I think unwritten rules are kind of like players pushing that line, and sometimes for the health of the club to win a game, to do well, and that's important. Winning is a big part of success and the value of a brand and organization in pro sports. But I also think you can recalibrate your own cultural environment from what the type of unwritten rule was. And again, things change so quickly. There's so many unwritten rules probably that have gone away because they pushed the envelope too much, and now they had to be recalibrated, and people are like, what are we doing? Why are we fighting? Why are players coming off the bench, or these things? So, but at the same time, I think, and it's a little bit to your world, like I don't mind players pushing and asking questions to try to help the club do well and win, if that makes sense, within the boundaries of what we're doing. And sometimes, like I said, in pro sports, they're going to go beyond that boundary, and it really is then what's up, how's the organization going to react, and what kind of culture and diversity they're going to have to kind of think about how to deal with it.
Any final questions out there? Okay, this is a great time to wrap it up. One more. That means I'm running. Okay.
In 1958, I was lucky enough that this institution lowered its standards and allowed me in, but not this institution. The school I went to had only been in existence for 3 years. They had not graduated anyone. So I entered. One of the first things I learned was I will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate anyone else in our group that does. I think it's important to realize the first part is not the most important. The second is the toleration and the lack of ethics of noting that somebody is doing something wrong and doing nothing or saying nothing about it. To me, the most important question anybody that's going to hire someone does is to ask the question, and you have the question to ask. What is that question that you want to ask first when you first interview someone for a job?
What is that first question? I guess, how do you make sure, I'll wordsmith a little bit. How do you make sure there's a culture fit? So how do you look and say, can you fit into our culture, or will there be a organ rejection? That's what I call it. When our system, nope, you don't fit. That will be our last question, and then we'll close for the day.
Well, one of the things that's changed at our level of hiring and things like that is the institution kind of requires that you expect somebody coming in to interview knows what our mission is, and so that they've spent that time knowing it and understanding it. And I think as you ask questions, it may not be a specific question, but as you ask questions and find out more about the person, do they seem to fit that mission?
You know, I'll say specifically in hiring coaches, you know, we hire administrators and staff and coaches and a lot of different people, and we all do. Specifically around hiring coaches, by the time they get to an on-campus interview or an in-person interview, I've got an assumption that they know the X's and O's. Maybe I shouldn't assume that, but that's an assumption that kind of through the process and through the vetting, you know, as an example, if we're hiring a gymnastics coach, I've never been a gymnast. I can't even warm up the way that they warm up. Dawn, I mean, what your daughter can do in the gymnastics facility, it's unbelievable. Kendra was an athlete when I was at the University of Minnesota. But assuming that the X's and O's are in place, to me it is about the culture fit. And it sounds really cliche. The first question is, hey, discuss why St. Thomas is a fit for you. I want to hear you articulate kind of how you fit at St. Thomas. That's really, really important. Ultimately, by the time you get to that particular interview, it's not whether or not you can do the job, to me. It's whether or not you're a right fit for us and we're a right fit for you. And that's kind of the start of that marriage, so to speak. And it sounds cliche. I think it's a pretty simple question, but it really tells a lot in how they kind of get to, because if they don't answer around some of the core values, then maybe you know it's just not naturally a good fit.
Yeah. And I would say in general, just to kind of add on to that it's a lot of literally almost my first question in most interviews is, you know, along those lines of the motivation. What caught your interest and why do you want to be here? And us managing that expectation is an easy way to find that out in the beginning, is to say, why do you want to be here? And if the number one answer is because I'm a huge football fan, that's probably not where I'm going to hire you on the business side, for example. Even on the coaching side, there's a component where I want to know, what is the motivation? And is that motivation aligned with who we are?
So I'm cognizant of these are actually always young men and still trying to navigate interviews, particularly in my world. So my first question is always, who's your favorite soccer star? And then who's your favorite soccer club in the world? So, and if they don't give the right answer, no. But I would say, I don't do it so bluntly, but in the end, I try to navigate a way to figure out if that person's all in. And really, just all in. Everything. The project, the club, the vision, the belief. Because again, if you get a sense that they are, you can deal with everything after that. So that to me is, I can't just do it in one sentence that way, but I try to get to a point where I can really navigate whether that person's all in for the club and the organization.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for this amazing panel, the information that you brought out, and hopefully we can continue this conversation, because I do think it's a conversation that needs to go back to all the spaces that we all go back to, and as we continue to kind of work on this piece, it's not anything that's going away. So Dean Maines and St. Thomas, I just want to thank you for being willing to put this event on. Thank you for your time, and thank all of you for making time to come out.
We're going to steal the microphone one more time. Leah and I had the opportunity and the gift of working at the Timberwolves together a long time ago, and she's a lot better basketball player than I am. But we both like the microphone, so it's a good friendship. I do want to give a small token to our panelists. This is done out of the goodness in their heart because they believe in the power of culture. And the fact that it is about following the rules, but it's about the power of culture. And it's about the power of creating culture. So I just want to thank them. I want to thank Veriti Group. They are in the back. They were our lead sponsor. And I'll tell you what, when Sally Manquist puts her mind to it, she takes you to the finish line. Twin Cities Orthopedics, Minnesota Vikings. We also want to thank, actually, Carval, who was a wonderful donor to our projects. So thank you to Christy for bringing Carval investors. Have a great day. Twin Cities Orthopedics, go get checked out.
Make sure to tell Les.